The knock at the door, a chilling encounter. It was a quiet night, eerily still, the kind of night where even the faintest sound carries weight. I was home alone, savoring the peace that the late hour offered. The clock read 10:30 p.m. when the first knock came. Sharp, deliberate, cutting through the silence like a blade. My heart startled in my chest. Who could it be at this hour? No one ever came by unannounced, especially so late. For a long, tense moment, I hesitated. My instincts told me not to answer. But something about the sound, it wasn't frantic, but it was unsettling, stirred my curiosity. Slowly and cautiously, I approached the door. The peephole felt like a barrier between safety and the unknown. My palms were clammy as I pressed my eye to it and froze. 2 children, a boy and a girl, stood completely still on my porch. They looked no older than 10, yet something about them was deeply wrong. They were dressed in clothes that seemed to belong to another decade, plain, simple, and outdated. Their rigid stillness and pale complexions sent shivers down my spine. I opened the door slightly, enough to speak, but before I could form a word, the boy's voice cut through the barely open space. "We need to use your phone," he said, his tone monotone, almost robotic. "Can we come in?" Every fiber of my being screamed at me to deny the request. Something wasn't right. The peculiar atmosphere around them, the uncanny stillness. These were not normal children. And then I saw it. Their eyes. Black. Not just dark, but fully, entirely black. Like 2 endless voids staring back at me. No whites, no irises, no life. My breath caught and I was frozen in place, my thoughts tripping over themselves in panic. The girl stepped forward slightly and spoke in the same detached monotone. "Let us in. We won't hurt you." There was no emotion in her words, no pleading. It didn't feel like a request. It felt like a command, a staged performance they had delivered many times before. The air inside my home grew unbearably heavy. It felt as though all warmth and color had drained out of the environment, replaced by a suffocating chill. My body refused to move, paralyzed under the weight of their empty gazes. They stood there waiting, unblinking, eerily calm. They were not annoyed, not impatient, just statuesque figures confident in whatever outcome they anticipated. My mind raced, the primal part of my brain knowing. Letting them in would mean the end of me. But I couldn't look away. It was as though their black eyes had locked onto something deep in my soul, stripping me of rational thought. I tried desperately to will myself to speak, to act, to say or do anything, but nothing came. Instead, I did the only thing I could. I slammed the door shut with trembling hands and turned the lock. As soon as the barrier closed, the knocking resumed, but this time it was louder, more insistent. Each thud reverberated through the house, each touch of knuckles against wood curling my fear tighter into my chest. "We can't come in unless you let us," the boy began to say, his voice rising steadily. Over and over the words repeated in that same unnatural tone. My ears rang with the sound, my breath shallow as every knock began to question my sanity. How long could this go on? Was I imagining it? Were they even real? I tried to steady myself, muscles trembling as adrenaline surged through me. I told myself I wouldn't open the door again. Whatever they were, it wasn't human. But their persistence clawed at something primal within me, as if daring me to abandon reason and succumb to curiosity. Suddenly, as abruptly as the knocking began, it stopped. The silence that replaced it was more unnerving than the noise itself. I waited, hesitant, too afraid to trust the stillness. When no sound came for what felt like an eternity, I gathered the fragile remnants of my courage and went to the door. I peered through the peephole, half expecting to see those void-like eyes staring back. Instead, there was nothing. No children. No sign they had ever been there. The porch was empty, the night outside quiet and undisturbed, but my heart refused to settle. I couldn't dismiss what I had seen or felt. It hadn't been a dream. I was certain of that. But those children, or whatever they were, had vanished without a trace. The following days were haunted by the memory. Their black, empty eyes never left my mind. Every knock at the door, every faint sound made my heart leap with panic. Was it them? Were they back? I began researching the encounter, desperate to understand what I had faced. What I discovered chilled me even further. I wasn't alone. Others had encountered these so-called black-eyed children. The stories were eerily similar. Children appearing late at night, requesting to be let in with monotonous persistence in those distinct, soulless eyes. No one knows what happens to those who let them in, but survivors all recount the same paralyzing dread and a gnawing certainty that refusing was their only salvation. Why do they knock? What do they seek? These questions remain unanswered, lingering like fragments of an unsolved nightmare. It's been weeks since the encounter, but the fear has not subsided. I've taken measures to fortify my home, extra locks, heavier curtains, but even that doesn't bring comfort. I know they're out there, somewhere, waiting, watching. And now every knock on the door becomes a moment of hesitation. Is it a delivery, a neighbor, or is it them again? My heart skips and my breath catches. Did I narrowly escape something unthinkable, or is my turn merely delayed? I wonder often about others. Some shared their stories online, similar but never complete. Some stayed silent, consumed by their experience. But what about those who said yes, those who invited them in? Are they still alive? Would we even know if they weren't? The memory of their black eyes is a living nightmare, a haunting tethered to every moment of stillness, every echo of an unexpected sound. And now I ask you, would you open the door? Would you let them in? This is more than just a story. It's a warning, an unsettling reminder that not all who knock are what they seem. So the next time your peace is broken by an unexpected visitor, tread carefully, because some invitations can never be taken back. The Night Watcher, a chilling neighbor horror story. It began as a mere coincidence, or so I tried to convince myself. A fleeting glance from the neighbor's window was nothing unusual, right? Neighbors look out their windows all the time. That's what I thought. That's what I told myself the first time I caught them staring. But this wasn't like those casual passing looks. It always happened at the same time, a time most people are sound asleep, 3 a.m. Night after night I would glance over, only to find them standing at their window, gaze locked on mine. No motion, no expression, just two eyes piercing through the shadows of the night, unblinking, unwavering. At first I laughed it off. Maybe they were a night owl, or an insomniac. But when something feels wrong, deep in your guts, in the pit of your stomach, you learn very quickly that it's best not to ignore it. Little did I know, my instincts were right. And what started as a passing discomfort soon unraveled into a waking nightmare. The first few nights were all the same. I'd glance up at my window at 3 a.m. and there they were, standing like a statue, their dimly lit silhouette framed by their apartment window. They didn't move or shift, they just watched. I remember one night in particular. It was cold and the wind rattled the windows of my apartment. I sat on my couch scrolling aimlessly through my phone when a strange pressure pushed me to glance toward their window. And there they were. The comforting hum of normalcy I tried clinging to vanished in that instant. You see, they weren't simply observing the world outside their window. The longer I looked, the sharper that intrusive feeling became. I wasn't being paranoid, I was the target. Their gaze wasn't just wandering through the dead of night, it was pinned on me. Was it curiosity? Malice? I didn't know. I didn't. Still, I didn't act. I ignored it, ignored the chilling dots my subconscious was connecting. I told myself, just ignore them, just don't think about it. I was wrong. About a week into this disturbing routine, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. At exactly 3:15 a.m., with adrenaline overpowering reason, I grabbed my jacket and stormed outside. The air was deathly still, the only sound being my heart pounding against my ribcage. I knocked on their door, each rap of my knuckles loud enough to wake the dead. Finally, the door creaked open, and the sight chilled me more than the frigid air. It was my neighbor, standing there as if they'd been expecting me. "Can I help you?" they asked casually, their voice smooth, pleasant even. But their smile, it was wrong. It didn't touch their eyes. It felt rehearsed, detached from any semblance of humanity. "Why do you keep staring into my window every night?" I demanded, trying to mask the war zone of fear inside me. Their response was equally chilling. "I don't know what you mean," they said, their tone calm and measured, as if this conversation was scripted. "I've been asleep, as always." I studied them, desperate to find cracks in the mask they wore, desperate for confirmation that this was some misunderstanding. But their expression betrayed nothing. And yet my gut screamed they were lying. Still, I backed off that night, maybe because I didn't want answers, maybe because I was too terrified to find out what they meant. The following morning, I woke up to find something that made me shiver to my very core. Faint scratch marks on the outside of my living room window. I stared at them, trying to explain it away. Maybe it was a stray branch from one of the nearby trees, or perhaps pigeons. But then I noticed the shape. The lines weren't random or natural. They outlined what looked like fingers. The marks formed a crude shape, resembling a hand pressed against my window. I pulled the blinds tightly closed, trying to erase the image from my mind, but it lingered, burned into my thoughts. I could no longer pretend this was nothing. That night, I decided to test the boundaries of whatever was happening. I turned off all the lights in my apartment and tucked myself into a corner of the living room where I had a clear view of my neighbor's window without being seen. The minutes passed with agonizing slowness. My body remained tense, every creak of the floorboards beneath me magnified in the silence. It was exactly 2:59 a.m. when the air in the room shifted. I don't know how else to describe it. It was as though every molecule grew heavier, suffocating me. And then, at precisely 3 a.m., they appeared. The figure stood there by their window as always, but this time I didn't back away or pretend to ignore them. Instead, I acted. Fueled by panic and anger, I bolted out of my apartment, bounding down the stairs and across the eerily quiet street. I pounded on their door harder than I ever had before. The door opened slowly, revealing the same calm face, only this time the mask slipped. Behind them, in the faint shadows of their apartment, I saw it. It was their face, yet it wasn't. Their eyes were two hollow voids, black, bottomless pits, and their mouth stretched unnaturally into a grotesque grin, far wider than any human expression. Then I heard it. The voice that spoke through them wasn't human. It was cold, alien, and utterly detached from the person I thought I knew. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. I stumbled back, paralyzed by the sheer malice that seemed to radiate from that thing. My body unfroze and I ran, nearly tripping over the stairs in my haste to get away. I didn't look back, I couldn't. The next morning, the apartment was empty. Gone were the curtains, the furniture, even the figure that had tormented me. The windows were covered by thick black fabric, and the door was locked as if no one had lived there. When I asked around, no one knew where they had gone. No one had seen them leave. It was as though they'd vanished overnight. But I knew better. Deep down, I understood the truth. That thing, whatever had been watching me, wasn't my neighbor. It had been using them, a vessel, a disguise, and I had come far too close to its grasp. To this day, I live with my blinds drawn tightly shut before 3 a.m. I never look out my windows during the dark hours of the night. Because I know, it's still out there. I know it didn't go anywhere, it's waiting. And someday someone will slip, someone will look where they shouldn't. And when they do, that empty black gaze, the eyes that seem to draw the very essence out of you, will find their next victim. So I ask you this, when the clock hits 3 a.m. and your curiosity stirs, would you dare look back at what's staring in the darkness? Be careful, you might not like what looks back. The Borrowed Shadow, a neighbor horror story. Have you ever wondered if your neighbor might not be exactly who or what they seem? That's where my story begins. It started with the kind of small interactions that happen in any neighborhood. My neighbor, Mr. Keller, was the perfect blend of polite and personable, a man who waved at every passerby and showed a genuine interest in people's lives. Or so I thought. At first, I dismissed his peculiarities as harmless quirks, but then the questions started. They weren't the polite conversational kind. They were oddly invasive, spoken with a smile that seemed a little too knowing. "How do you usually spend your evenings?" he'd ask, his gaze lingering. "What time do you go to bed? Do you ever get up in the middle of the night?" I'd laugh it off as his unique version of friendliness, but those questions stuck with me. Why would anyone care about such small details of someone's routine? I told myself not to overthink it. After all, what could he possibly gain from learning when I went to bed? But then things moved beyond mere words. It was on an otherwise uneventful evening when I first saw it, the shadow. I was walking past Mr. Keller's house, my mind on autopilot, when movement in his living room caught my eye. But behind him, the shadow he cast on the wall wasn't ordinary at all. Shadows are supposed to follow their source. They're tethered to you, mimicking every movement with precision. But this one didn't. Mr. Keller's shadow seemed delayed, lurching in jerky steps as though it had a mind of its own. It hovered in spots too long before catching up to him, and sometimes it didn't move at all. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, I noticed that the shadow wasn't even there. Just a black smudge on the wall, like an empty space where it should have been. For a long while, I stood frozen on the sidewalk, unsure of what I was witnessing. My rational mind scrambled to explain it. A trick of the light? A reflection? But deep down, something colder, something more primal, told me I shouldn't be watching this. I hurried home, drawing all the blinds and locking every door behind me. Still, unease crawled beneath my skin, a sensation like being watched from the dark corners of the room. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside set my nerves on edge. Eventually, I told myself it was all in my head. I just needed rest. But just as I began to drift off, 3 soft knocks echoed from my front door. Knock, knock, knock. I froze. The clock beside me read just shy of midnight. No one would visit this late, not for anything good at least. With hesitation weighing every step, I crept to the door and peered through the peephole. It was him. Mr. Keller stood on my porch, smiling in that same easy yet unsettling way. But this time, something was different. His smile stretched too far, his lips curling unnaturally, as if they struggled to contain the grin. And his eyes were wrong. They gleamed like dark glass, vacant yet heavy with malice. Hesitantly, I opened the door just enough to speak. "Hi, Mr. Keller, is everything all right?" "Hello," he said, his voice almost hollow, as if someone else was speaking through him. I was wondering if I could borrow something. Confused, I forced a nervous laugh. "Of course, what do you need?" His head tilted slightly, his stare boring into me. Silence stretched, unnatural and suffocating, until he finally spoke again. "I need something. Specific." I swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the door. "Specific?" I echoed, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded slowly, his smile faltering for just a moment before returning, more unnerving than ever. "You see, I've borrowed a lot already. Your routine, your habits, your life. But there's still one thing I need." Before I could fully process his words, his hand began to move toward me. Or rather, his shadow's hand did. The shadow that stretched out from him didn't match his physical movements. It was darker, its fingers grotesquely long, curling into claw-like points. My instincts screamed before my mind caught up, and I slammed the door shut with all the strength I could muster. But it wasn't over. Scratches echoed through the night, light at first but growing insistent. Something was scraping against the outside of my window. Heart pounding, I hurried to pull the curtains tighter, but through a thin gap I saw it. Something was scraping against the outside of my window. Heart pounding, I hurried to pull the curtains tighter, but through a thin gap I saw it. My blood turned cold as I stared. That same clawed shadow, the one that moved unattached from its owner, was probing at the glass, its form flickering like a living nightmare. I stumbled backward, trapping a scream in my throat. By the time I gathered the courage to look again, it was gone. But the memory of its presence lingered in every corner of my house. Morning arrived like a lifeline, bringing light that banished the terror, but not the questions. When I peeked out the window, Mr. Keller's house stood utterly empty. There was no trace of him. His car, his furniture, his life. It had all disappeared overnight. And yet I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't truly gone. A faint imprint remained, not in his house, but in my mind. His words echoed endlessly. "I've borrowed your life, but there's still one thing I need. Now, I can't sit in a room without glancing at the corners, wondering what hides where the light fades. Shadows were once so ordinary, the backdrop of daily life, but now I know better. They can borrow more than just light. They can steal fragments of your existence piece by piece until you're no longer whole. And so I ask you, listener, if your neighbor came to your door one night asking to borrow something, would you let them in? What they want might not be what you think, but by the time you realize the cost, it could already be too late. They're still out there, waiting, watching, lingering just where the light begins to fade. Would you let them in?